April 29, 1945, 15:17 hours. Main gate, Dachau Concentration Camp, Bavaria. Private First Class John Veitch of the 45th Infantry Division's 157th Regiment pressed his back against the stone wall outside Dachau's main entrance, while machine gun fire from the guard towers kicked up dust near his boots. His squad had been fighting through the outskirts of the camp for the past hour, clearing SS positions that were firing sporadically as guards tried to escape or mount final resistance. The fighting was chaotic, some guards shooting, others fleeing, still others trying to surrender before prisoners or American soldiers could reach them. Through gaps in the gunfire, Veitch could hear something that made his skin crawl. A sound like thousands of people moaning or crying, a collective noise of human suffering that rose from somewhere inside the camp walls. His squad leader had told them they were liberating a prison camp, that they'd find political prisoners and POWs. Nobody had prepared them for the sound of mass human despair. The machine gun in the tower went silent, either out of ammunition or abandoned by its crew. Veitch's squad moved forward to the main gate, a massive iron barrier with the words Arbeit macht frei forged into the metalwork. One of his squad mates tried the gate and found it unlocked. When they pulled it open, the scene beyond stopped them all mid-stride. Thousands of prisoners in striped uniforms pressed against the interior fence, their faces skeletal, their bodies emaciated to the point where Veitch couldn't immediately process that these were living human beings rather than corpses. For a moment, nobody moved. Not the American soldiers, not the prisoners. Then someone in the crowd shouted, "Amerikaner!" And the entire mass of prisoners surged forward, crying, screaming, reaching through the fence toward the soldiers with hands that were little more than bone and skin. Veitch felt his rifle slip from his hands as a prisoner grabbed his arm through the wire. Not threatening, but desperate, as if physical contact with an American would prove this wasn't another cruel trick. The man was crying and speaking in a language Veitch didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. "Thank you. You came. We're alive. You came." "Jesus Christ," someone behind Veitch whispered. "What is this place?" For the 32,000 prisoners still breathing inside Dachau's wire on April 29, 1945, the arrival of American forces meant the impossible had happened. They'd survived long enough to see liberation, had outlasted the regime that had tried to destroy them, had witnessed the moment when the gates opened and enemies became saviors. The place of death. Dachau had been operating for 12 years by the time American tanks reached its gates, longer than any other Nazi concentration camp, the prototype that established procedures and methods that would be replicated across the system of camps that eventually numbered over 1,000. It had opened on March 20, 1933, barely 2 months after Hitler became chancellor, initially holding political prisoners whom the Nazi regime considered threats to its consolidation of power. The camp's evolution documented Nazi Germany's descent from authoritarian state to genocidal regime. The first prisoners were German communists, social democrats, trade unionists, political opponents who were imprisoned without trial. Then came criminals, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Romani people, groups Nazi ideology deemed undesirable. Eventually came Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, resistance fighters from occupied countries, anyone the regime wanted to disappear into the concentration camp system where death was eventual, if not immediate. By April 1945, Dachau held approximately 32,000 prisoners from across Europe and beyond. Germans, Poles, Russians, French, Italians, Greeks, Dutch, Belgians, and dozens of other nationalities. They were political prisoners, Jews, priests, and clergy who'd opposed the regime, resistance fighters, intellectuals, artists, and ordinary people who'd been swept up by the machinery of Nazi persecution. They'd survived typhus epidemics that killed thousands, starvation rations that reduced grown men to 70 pounds, forced labor that worked people to death, and the random brutality of guards who could kill without consequence. The mortality rate had accelerated catastrophically in the final months as the camp became dumping ground for prisoners evacuated from camps in the east as Soviet forces advanced. Prisoners arrived on death marches, already dying from starvation and disease, only to enter camp where conditions were collapsing under impossible overcrowding. In the 4 months before liberation, approximately 15,000 prisoners died in Dachau, an average of 125 deaths daily from typhus, starvation, and exhaustion. The approach. The 45th Infantry Division had been advancing through Bavaria for weeks, fighting scattered German resistance as the Third Reich collapsed around them. They'd received intelligence reports about Dachau, knew there was a concentration camp in the town, but the reports were vague about what they'd find. Some briefings mentioned political prisoners. Others said labor camp. None adequately conveyed the scale or nature of what 12 years of Nazi concentration camp operations had created. As American forces approached Dachau on April 29th, they began encountering evidence of the camp before they reached it. Boxcars sat on railway sidings filled with corpses, prisoners who'd died during transport and been left where they fell. Bodies lay beside roads where prisoners had collapsed during evacuation marches. The dead accumulated as the division moved closer, creating trail of evidence that suggested whatever waited inside the camp walls would be worse than anything they'd seen in 2 years of European combat. Brigadier General Henning Linden, Assistant Division Commander of the 42nd Infantry Division, whose units also participated in Dachau's liberation, later described the approach. "We knew we were getting close to something terrible from the bodies we were finding. Dead prisoners in rail cars, bodies along the roads, evidence of mass death that prepared us, or we thought it prepared us, for what we'd find inside. But you can't really prepare for encountering systematic human destruction on that scale. You can intellectually understand that camps existed, that people died there. Actually walking through the gates and seeing thousands of barely living people who'd survived that system, it's different than understanding it abstractly." The fighting at the gates. The fighting around Dachau's perimeter on April 29th was confused and brutal. SS guards in the towers and at defensive positions fired on approaching American forces. Some guards attempted to flee as Americans approached. Others tried to surrender before prisoners could reach them. The prisoners themselves could hear the gunfire outside and understood that liberation might be hours away, creating desperate tension between hope that they'd survive to see it and fear that guards would massacre them before Americans could arrive. The actual breakthrough happened at multiple points, nearly simultaneously. Elements of both the 45th and 42nd Infantry Divisions reached different sections of the camp within minutes of each other. Some American soldiers forced the main gate, others cut through wire fencing at other locations. The SS guards' resistance collapsed rapidly. Some fled, some surrendered, some were shot by advancing Americans or were killed by prisoners who reached them. The immediate aftermath of liberation at Dachau included violence that wouldn't be recorded in official histories with the same detail as the liberation itself. American soldiers who encountered the evidence of mass death and saw the condition of surviving prisoners reacted with rage that overwhelmed military discipline. Some guards who tried to surrender were shot. Prisoners who could move attacked guards they caught. The line between combat, execution, and revenge blurred in ways that participants would struggle to explain or justify later. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, who commanded the battalion that first entered Dachau, later acknowledged the chaos. "When my men saw what had been done in that camp, saw the conditions prisoners were in, saw the bodies and the evidence of systematic murder, some of them lost control. I tried to maintain discipline, but the rage was overwhelming. Guards were shot who might have been trying to surrender. I won't say it was right, but I understood why it happened. Walking through that camp, seeing what those guards had been part of, it was hard to see them as prisoners of war, deserving of protection, rather than as war criminals deserving of immediate justice." The first contact. For the prisoners watching through the fences as American soldiers poured through the gates, the moment of liberation created psychological shock that many couldn't immediately process. They'd been waiting to die, some for days, some for weeks, some for years. The possibility of rescue had become so remote that many had stopped hoping for it. When rescue actually arrived, the The psychological adjustment from certain death to possible survival was more than many could handle coherently. The emotional responses varied wildly. Some prisoners collapsed crying. Others screamed with joy. Some prayed. Many stood frozen, unable to move or speak. A few tried to attack guards who were being taken into custody. The chaos of liberation, mixed with the chaos of 12 years of imprisonment, suddenly ending created scenes that the American soldiers found as overwhelming as the prisoners did. Private John Lee moved through crowds of prisoners who were pressing toward the Americans, trying to touch them, trying to speak to them, trying to confirm that liberation was real. They grabbed at us, not violently but desperately, Lee recalled. They wanted to touch our uniforms, our equipment, anything American to prove we were real, and they were actually being liberated. Some tried to talk, but couldn't get words out, just sobbing. Others spoke in languages none of us understood, but the meaning was clear. Thank you. Thank you. You saved us. A few just collapsed when they saw us. The relief of knowing they'd survived was literally too much to bear. The American soldiers responded as best they could, with no training or preparation for the situation. They offered water from canteens. They distributed K-rations and chocolate. They tried to comfort people who were beyond comfort. They called for medics to treat prisoners who were obviously dying. The improvised humanitarian response began immediately, driven by soldiers' instincts rather than by any orders or established procedures. The horror revealed. As American forces secured the camp and began moving through its sections, they encountered evidence of systematic mass murder that exceeded anything they'd imagined. The crematorium with its ovens still containing remains, the gas chamber that had been disguised as a shower room, the barracks where prisoners lay dying of typhus and starvation, the rail cars filled with corpses. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. This had been a place designed for death, where systematic murder had been standard procedure. The American soldiers' reactions to what they found ranged from rage to horror to psychological shutdown. Some vomited, some cried, some went silent and wouldn't speak for hours. Some became violently angry at guards or at the situation itself. The camp represented evil on scale that challenged their understanding of what human beings were capable of doing to other human beings. Technical Sergeant Peter First, who'd fought since North Africa, tried to describe his reaction. I'd seen combat casualties, civilians killed in bombings, all kinds of death that war produces. But this was different. This wasn't people killed in combat. This was systematic murder. People worked and starved to death deliberately. Mass killing as industrial process. The efficiency of it was almost worse than the cruelty. They'd created a machine for destroying people, and it had been running for 12 years. Walking through those barracks, seeing people who weighed 70 or 80 pounds still breathing, seeing the crematorium, and understanding what it meant. I've never been able to fully process what we saw that day. The medical emergency. The liberation of Dachau immediately became medical emergency as American forces confronted approximately 32,000 prisoners in desperate need of food, water, and medical care. Many were dying from typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and starvation. The medical resources available were inadequate for the scale of need. A few battalion medical sections with limited supplies facing thousands of patients requiring immediate treatment. The medical personnel who entered Dachau within hours of liberation faced challenges that exceeded any training or preparation. They were treating diseases they'd rarely seen, managing malnutrition so severe that feeding required extreme caution to prevent refeeding syndrome, dealing with patients too weak to communicate their symptoms. The work was overwhelming and often futile. Many prisoners were too far gone to save regardless of treatment quality. Captain Marcus Klein, a battalion surgeon, documented the medical situation. We had maybe a dozen medics initially, and basic field medical supplies. We were facing thousands of patients who needed immediate hospitalization. Many were dying as we tried to treat them. The typhus was epidemic. Approximately 15,000 prisoners were infected. We had to establish quarantine areas, triage patients by survivability, make impossible decisions about who might live if treated versus who was too far gone. The mortality continued after liberation. We lost approximately 2,000 prisoners in the first few days, despite our best efforts. Another 1,000 in the following weeks. Some were too damaged physically to recover even with adequate food and medicine. The immediate medical response overwhelming, the proximity too close, the systematic nature too obvious for plausible denial. Lieutenant William Bradford, who supervised civilian tours, described the confrontations. We made them walk through the entire camp, made them see the barracks, the crematorium, the rail cars full of bodies. Some cried, some vomited. Many claimed they didn't know, that the SS had kept everything secret. But the camp had been operating for 12 years. Thousands of people had been imprisoned there. The smoke from the crematorium was visible from town. The idea that nobody knew was absurd. Whether they actively participated or passively accepted, the result was the same. This had happened in their country with their knowledge or willful ignorance. The witnessing. American command recognized immediately that Dachau represented evidence that needed to be documented comprehensively. Orders came down to photograph everything, preserve evidence, record testimony from survivors, and ensure that what had happened in the camp would be irrefutable for future prosecution and historical record. Signal Corps photographers and journalists who arrived within days of liberation documented the camp in exhaustive detail. The photographs would become some of the most powerful evidence of Nazi atrocities. Images of survivors, of the dead in rail cars, of the crematorium, of conditions that words struggled to adequately convey. The visual record served multiple purposes: evidence for war crimes trials, documentation for historical record, and proof to skeptical audiences that concentration camps had actually existed as described. General Dwight Eisenhower, who visited Dachau's subcamp at Ohrdruf earlier in April, had ordered comprehensive documentation of camps with explicit purpose of preventing future denial. His reasoning was prescient. Get it all on record now. Get the films, get the witnesses, because somewhere down the road of history, some bastard will get up and say that this never happened. The survivors' processing. The days and weeks following Dachau's liberation involved massive humanitarian operation to care for surviving prisoners while processing them for eventual repatriation or resettlement. The operation required transforming the camp from death facility to recovery facility, treating thousands of sick prisoners, providing adequate nutrition, and beginning the long process of helping Sans focused on providing basic necessities: clean water, basic food that wouldn't kill starving people, rudimentary sanitation to prevent disease spread. Army engineers established water systems and latrines. Supply officers requisitioned medicine and food. Medical personnel worked around the clock treating the sickest patients while trying to stabilize the rest. The feeding challenge. One of the first challenges American forces faced was feeding prisoners who were starving, but whose digestive systems couldn't handle normal food after months or years of inadequate nutrition. Well-meaning soldiers who gave prisoners their K-rations or concentrated foods inadvertently killed some whose systems couldn't process the rich food. Medical personnel had to establish controlled feeding protocols that gradually increased caloric intake to prevent refeeding syndrome. The feeding operations began immediately, but had to be carefully managed to avoid killing people with kindness. Initial rations were limited to thin soups and small bread portions. The quantities increased gradually as digestive systems recovered. The frustration of having abundant food available, but having to restrict what was given to people who were starving, was difficult for soldiers who wanted to help immediately. Private Robert Henderson described the feeding challenge. "We had all this food, cases of rations, supplies we could share. But the medics told us we couldn't just give it to prisoners because it could kill them. Their stomachs had shrunk. Their systems couldn't handle normal food. We had to prepare special soups, give tiny portions, increase slowly over days. It felt wrong to restrict food from starving people, but following the protocols saved lives. Some prisoners didn't understand why we weren't giving them more. They'd been starving for so long that our caution seemed like cruelty. But the prisoners who ignored the restrictions and ate too much often died from it. The civilian confrontation. American forces brought German civilians from nearby Dachau town to tour the camp and witness what had existed in their proximity. The forced tours were designed to confront German civilians with the atrocities that had been committed in their country, often with their knowledge or passive acceptance. The civilian reactions ranged from horror to denial to claims of ignorance. Some appeared genuinely shocked. Others claimed they'd had no idea what happened in the camp, despite living close enough to smell the crematorium. American soldiers had little patience for claimed ignorance. The evidence was two survivors rebuild lives that had been shattered. The recovery was gradual and incomplete. Many prisoners died in the weeks after liberation, despite receiving care. Others recovered physically, but carried psychological trauma that would last lifetimes. Some survivors discovered that their families had been murdered, their communities destroyed, their homes gone. Liberation meant survival, but not necessarily restoration of what had been lost. For the prisoners who did survive and recover, liberation marked beginning of long journey from victim to survivor, from prisoner to free person, from barely living to actually living. The psychological adjustment took months or years. Many struggled with survivor's guilt, with nightmares, with inability to process what they'd experienced. The liberation was beginning of recovery, not its completion. The closing truth. The tears that Dachau prisoners shed when American soldiers arrived weren't just tears of joy or relief. They were tears of people who'd survived the impossible, who'd outlasted the regime that tried to destroy them, who'd witnessed the moment when salvation arrived after they'd stopped believing salvation was possible. The American soldiers who broke through Dachau's gates weren't prepared for what they found, weren't trained for the humanitarian crisis they encountered, weren't ready for the moral reckoning that came from witnessing systematic human destruction. But they responded as best they could, providing food, water, and medical care, documenting evidence, and helping survivors begin recovering from experiences that defied recovery. The liberation of Dachau proved that even the darkest places could be opened to light, that systematic evil could be defeated by those willing to fight against it, and that mercy could follow victory when victors chose compassion over revenge. The camp that had been designed for death became place of healing. The prisoners who'd been reduced to near death began journeys back to life. And the soldiers who'd fought across Europe discovered that the most important battle they'd fight wasn't against enemy soldiers, but against the evil that concentration camps represented. The systematic destruction of human dignity and life that had to be ended, had to be documented, and had to be remembered, so it could never happen again. The gates that opened on April 29, 1945, didn't just free prisoners from physical imprisonment. They opened the world's eyes to what Nazi Germany had created, what industrialized hatred and systematic persecution could produce, and what humanity was capable of enduring and surviving. The prisoners who broke down in tears when Americans arrived were crying for themselves, for those who hadn't survived, and for the moment when hope, which had died in that place thousands of times, suddenly, impossibly, miraculously returned.